And welcome. So it happens to be Valentine's Day, which for me means it's February 14th. And for many of us, Valentine's Day is a day of trauma. You know, the early memories of, am I going to get a Valentine's Day card, and all that dreck. But it is a time to kind of explore, well, it's an invitation to kind of sense, what does it mean to be aware of your heart? What does it mean to be true to your heart? I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And this following story may be a familiar one for you. It has many different iterations. It's a cute one. John invites his mother over for dinner. And during the meal, his mother can't help but notice how handsome John's roommate is. And over the course of the evening, while watching the two interact, she starts to wonder if there's more between John and his roommate than meets the eye. Reading his mom's thoughts, John pulls his mother aside and says, "I know what you may be thinking, Mom, but I assure you, Mark and I are just roommates." About a week later, Mark says to John, ever since your mother came to dinner, I haven't been able to find the silver gravy ladle. You don't suppose she took it?" John says, "Well, I doubt it, but I'll write her an email just to be sure." So he sits down at his computer and he writes, "Dear Mother, I'm not saying you did take the gravy ladle from my house, and I'm not saying you did not take the gravy ladle, but the fact remains, one has been missing ever since you were here for dinner." Later that day, John receives an email from his mother that says, "Dear John, I'm not saying that you do sleep with Mark, and I'm not saying that you do not sleep with Mark. But the fact remains that if he was sleeping in his own bed, he would have found the gravy ladle by now. Love, Mom." When Jack Kornfield reads that story, he says, the moral is never lie to your mother. And there's some truth to that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, what does it mean to speak truth? What does it mean to speak from the heart? Which is something I'm not very good at. So this is why I'm giving this talk. What I'd like to talk about in 4 parts. In order to be truthful, we have to be aware of self. We have to be aware of ourselves and our conditioning. In order to effectively speak truth, we have to be aware of the other. We have to be able to sense what another person is feeling and wanting. I'd like to talk about 2 basic tendencies which are kind of grounded in Buddhist psychology, of kind of the aversive nature of the mind, the greed nature of the mind, and the confused nature of the mind, and how that shows up in relationship, and how many of us we're dominated by one of those particular energies. And fourth, some kind of guidelines for speaking truth, which are grounded in the essential teachings from the Buddha. So I hope you find this helpful. It's speaking truth when it's challenging is really, really hard. And I think we all have certain blocks. And the more aware you can be of your own blocks, the more effective you can be. So many, many, many years ago, I was in a relationship for about a year with a wonderful, wonderful person, and it just kind of came to an end. And she suggested at the end, she said, you might want to consider doing some inquiry, maybe even some therapy on relationships, because when it comes to relationships, you're pretty messed up. Okay, so the truth is, she used another phrase for messed up. But I heard what she said, and I thought, I think you got a point there. So it just so turns out there was living in Western Massachusetts at that time. There's a guy who lived about 4 doors away from me. He was a therapist, and he did EMDR, eye movement desensitization and processing, which is I'd heard of it, I'd never done it. And with it, you're working with eye patterns you're doing a particular inquiry, and you're moving your eyes back and forth, and you close your eyes, and oftentimes there's some very powerful imagery or very powerful patterns that you can begin to see. So I was curious about the technique, and I thought, well, this is a worthy thing for me to look at because I was aware I had some patterns around relationship. And so I won't go into all the details, but in essence, I was doing the eye patterning stuff, and I closed my eyes, and I just had these sort of like flashbacks on all the intimate relationships I'd had with people, and noticing how they kind of all ended the same way, with me sort of like closing down, closing off, and withdrawing. And I also noticed, to my utter horror, that they all kind of trace back to, guess who? My mother. It was really powerful because I saw, here is this pattern that I have of attraction, seduction, and then withdrawal. Like not having the, I don't know, the emotional maturity, I think might be one way to put it. The emotional maturity to kind of maintain an intimate connection. And it's really interesting. I mean, and again, when I had that experience of sort of the flashbacks going back to this primary relationship with my mother, it was like, oh, come on. This is so cliche, but it's true. At least it is for me. And when you maybe just take a moment now and you just sort of think back to your primary energetic relationship with your primary caretakers, your mother or father, or whoever took care of you, what was that like? What was there any disturbance in the force in that relationship? And it becomes a really interesting question of how does that show up now? You know, when we really look at the nature of the self, it becomes very clear that there are two qualities of the self. There's what we can call the relative self, which is the self of the persona of your conditioning, and then there's the absolute self, that was the unconditioned self, if you will. And so you have your persona. It's your presentation to the world. It's how you figured out how to avoid pain, how to get ahead. And it's sort of like putting on a Halloween mask. This is how you present yourself to the world. And of course, as we grow up, we try different personas, and then we sort of settle on how we're going to present ourselves. And the challenge, of course, becomes, it's like wearing a Halloween mask and then starting to believe that you're the mask. So it becomes a very interesting inquiry. How do you present yourself? How do you present yourself to the world in a way where you can either avoid domination or dominate others? And how identified are you with your persona? How identified are you with your presentation? Now, one of the really, really cool things about mindfulness, meditation, is you become more aware. And over time, you start to become more aware of your filters. You start to become more aware of how you defend yourself, how you present yourself. And what I find really interesting is not just me, but for many, many people, the more you become aware of yourself and your personas and your own fears and your own anxieties, the more bandwidth you have, the more you can start to empathize and resonate with others. The more others don't seem quite so much different. You begin to recognize what's referred to as self and other and self, how much of this human experience is shared. You know, we tend to be so caught in self-consciousness. And one teacher said quite emphatically, do you think anyone notices you? When you walk down the street, do you think anyone really notices you? They don't. They're so terrified about how they're being perceived and the persona they're projecting, they don't notice anything. And I think there's something true about that. We are all so self-absorbed, self-preservational, that we don't see what's going on. We don't see others. And this becomes a really powerful tool, if you will, or powerful leverage into becoming more truly, truly awake, which is your capacity to be more aware of the other. You know, we have this way of just sensing how everyone's different. But I remember being on an elevator once. And someone got on the elevator and I said, "Hey, nice day." And he said, "Yeah, it's cold." And normally I'm not a really super outgoing person, but I said, "Yeah, well, at least it's not as cold as Wisconsin." And he said, "You're from Wisconsin?" I said, "No, I'm not from Wisconsin, but I went to college and I lived there for 6 years." I said, "Oh, where'd you go to college?" "Well, I went to Beloit College." "You did? What years?" "Well, I went here this year." And they were like, "Oh, well, I was 5 years earlier. But what was your major?" "Oh, English Lit and Comp." "Really? Did you have McBride as a professor?" "I did." And suddenly, boom, we're having this amazing engaged conversation. It's really interesting how we perceive others as different until we begin to recognize what we share. And as soon as we recognize what we share, then connection and intimacy can really start to flow. And so it becomes a really fascinating process of how do we build connection? How do we tune ourselves in to being more aware of other? So way back when, I did a lot of development fundraising for 3-4 years, and just terrified. And we really put ourselves out there asking people for money on a regular basis. And so I looked for how I could figure out how I could survive this assignment. And I found a book. The book is called Influencing with Integrity. Influencing with Integrity. Sort of what the title wasn't saying was like, here's how you can manipulate people to your will. And I used a lot of neuro-linguistic programming techniques on how to sort of like gain someone's attention and gain someone's trust, and how to move people with integrity toward what you want. So of course I became fascinated because here's this book of hacks on behavior, and I really, really got into it. One of the techniques is called mirroring. Now again, most people like people who are like them. Pretty simple. So my conversation in the elevator was like, whoa, oh my God, we have all this in common. Instantly, we kind of liked each other. So in this technique of mirroring, when you're in conversation with someone, you start to mirror their behavior back to them. And you do it physically. So if they're leaning to the right, you lean to the right. If they lean back, you lean back. If they talk loud, you talk loud. And it seems really, really, you're incredibly self-conscious when you do this, but it's subtle. The other person usually doesn't see it. And inevitably what happens, they start to relax. Hey, this person's like me. I think I kind of like them. I used this with as much integrity as I could, but I was also really excited about sort of like the potency around it. But I just wanted to share one story. And this is back in the ashram days. I was pretty wet behind the ears, but I was going to be leading, I think, my second week-long meditation retreat. And I had meditated a lot, but I hadn't done a lot of retreats. And there was one senior person in the organization who was kind of renowned for being difficult to work with. Got into a lot of power struggles and a lot of conflict. And I was told that he was going to be assisting me in this retreat. And then I was told he was just going to be completing a retreat the day before and then coming to assist me. I was unbelievably freaked out. I thought, I'm supposed to be leading this peaceful, harmonious meditation retreat with someone who considers himself an expert, who's just coming off a retreat, probably filled with lots of excitement and knowledge. And we're going to be in this power struggle during the week. I was unbelievably disturbed. And so he was coming to my office to kind of go over the curriculum. I thought, oh my, the only way out here is to mirror. And so he sat down across from me, and he leaned forward, I leaned forward. He leaned back, I leaned back. He talked soft, I talked soft. And it was so, I just kept doing it through our whole conversation. I thought, if he realizes what I'm doing, he's just going to punch me in the face. But we continued on. He would, he would get animated. I would get animated. And then at one point, he just stopped and he paused and he looked around and he said, I'm really, really looking forward to working with you. He said, very few people think like us. And he said, you're the director. I want to be supportive. I really want this to work. And it turned to be an unbelievable experience, where I had formed an ally. Now, on the one hand, that was sort of manipulative on my part, but on the other hand, it actually created a rapport. And in that sense of rapport, there was a commonality. So it's really interesting when you think about someone you're in conflict with right now. You might just, if you like, you can close your eyes. We'll make this a little bit of a contemplation. Someone you're in conflict with right now, you might just sense, what is it like to feel in opposition? What does it feel like inside to feel them as the other? And imagine if you could, just for a few moments, do a complete role reversal. Kind of get inside their body. Imagine breathing like they would breathe. What do you think they are feeling right now? What do you think, or what do you imagine they're wanting? It's wanting something that's not happening. And you might take a moment just to sense if they had what they were wanting or needing, what might that be like for them? How might that shift inside for them? So you might deepen your breath. If you like, you can let your eyes open. This whole piece here around coming into resonance with someone is so interesting. Meeting someone where they are. I told that story to a good friend of mine in the ashram. The whole idea of mirroring someone, like matching their physical behavior, their physical traits, and how that can create a sense of rapport. And he told me how, like, the next day, he was down in Hartford, Connecticut, and trying to get to some address, and he was utterly lost, completely lost, and late for an appointment. And there was a kind of backed up traffic, but there was a policeman, and he just pulled over, and he got out. And the policeman came over and he was waving his arms over. He said, what do you think you're doing? You can't park here. My friend, he said, I don't know what came over me, but I put my arms overhead and I said, I know I shouldn't park here, but I'm lost. I'm trying to find this address. And the policeman just said, oh, well, let me help you. So again, that sense of like just the capacity to resonate can be so powerful. And taking it beyond that, because that's in some ways can be a parlor trick. Your capacity to imagine what another person is feeling and to imagine what another person is needing opens up a huge amount of information. Because the truth is, our lives are driven by unmet needs. So your capacity to be aware of others, to sense what they're feeling, to sense their desires, their needs, their impulses, is going to give you a huge amount of information. And on the one hand, you can influence with integrity. And there's a shadow side to that. But on the other hand, you can also create a connection. It's a way to truly connect and deepen. So I found for myself and I got to practice a lot because I asked people, I had 3 appointments per day asking people for $1,000. That was my assignment. And it's like it was maybe I was in my 20s. And of course, I learned, I could tell through conversation, train myself as to how people move their eyes and the language they use, whether they were more kinesthetically based, if they processed kinesthetically, or they were more auditory, or if they were more visual. So I would ask, how does $1,000 sound? Or, well, what would it feel like if you made a gift for $1,000? Or could you just see yourself writing a check for $1,000? I'm not saying this with pride, because there was an element to it of attachment. On the other hand, and I was aware that there's sort of like an attachment to how does these hacks work? But on the other hand, I deeply believed in our mission, and I did have very strong relationships with people that were making donations. But the other side of all of that, all of the techniques for gaining rapport, is connecting and deepening connection and deepening intimacy. And that's what it all comes down to. Because what gets in the way of intimacy and what gets in the way of presence are three main energies. They're sometimes referred to in Buddhist philosophy as the three poisons. And that is when your mind is poisoned by greed, by unrelenting wanting and desire. When your mind is poisoned by hate, aversion, judgment, blame, ill will. And when your mind is poisoned by delusion, when the mind is confused, it just doesn't know what's true. What I found is in the relational field, it tends to kind of mostly come down to kind of the greed versus hate, or we could call the wanting mind versus the aversive mind. Now, it's a pretty interesting thing here, because I remember a friend of mine told me that when he was in high school, he was head of the debate team. And I told him, I said, if it had existed, I would have been head of the conflict avoidance team. So you can sense which my basic type is. I tend to be more avoidant. And in many relationships, there's someone who is intimacy avoidant versus someone who is intimacy insecure. That is to say, one is sort of pushing away, the other is sort of insecure and grasping. And guess what? It shows up in my relationship. And quite often what happens, it happens, but it's a little more past tense, because I think Tara, my wonderful wife, and I are a little more on to our patterns, just primarily through the experience of pain and discomfort. And that is to say that my pattern is around avoidancy and withdrawal. And so when we get into a conflict, I tend to sort of lean back, let's take space, which makes her more insecure. And then her insecurity will show up as some kind of aggression. It'll show up as some kind of judgment, some kind of, blame, which of course makes me want to become more avoidant, and then eventually, kaboom, kind of it explodes. But it's very, very interesting how, as I have begun to recognize that when my partner is insecure, and it can sort of be that wanting, that grasping, that there's fear. And the core of that fear is the fear of abandonment, the fear of not being lovable. And for me, the avoidance is sort of that's the same thing in many ways. Like, I'm going to reduce my needs so I won't be disappointed. And somehow I've managed to kind of rewire, for the most part, that when I see Tara moving into kind of the wanting, and part of that of kind of the judging, that she's afraid. And I can be with fear. My heart can respond to fear a lot more easily than it can to judgment. So that rewiring has been really, really helpful. And so the question becomes, what are your patterns? Now you can say, and we'll revisit this in a moment, that when you think about these three energetic elements that get in the way of intimacy, of greed, hatred, and delusion, people who tend to be a little bit more of the greed type, they tend to be more outgoing. Now, every coin has two sides. So on the one side, they have a capacity to connect. They see possibilities. They're energized by connection. They're energized by sort of like this outgoing energy. So they're kind of a big yes to life. It's a really, really wonderful thing. The other side of the coin is not so discerning. They tend to overextend. Their attention gets fractured because they kind of want it all. The aversive type, or again, hatred aversive type, they tend to be more discerning. Again, the positive side of the coin is to really ask themselves, is this what I really, really want? They tend to be a little more analytical. They can see more clearly into the distinctions, as opposed to yes. It's like, well, there are gradations of yes. And so at its best, the discerning type can say, like, okay, is what I'm attracted to what I really, really want? And then if it's a yes, then they can give themselves to it fully. On the other hand, because they are aversive and sort of tend to be more judgmental and analytical, they can be more withdrawn, which can lead to a sense of loneliness and a sense of isolation. Now, the deluded type, kind of the confused type, if you will, as someone said, they're really fun at parties. They're just a huge yes. They're spontaneous. They follow the energy. They go with what feels right in the moment. The shadow side is they can be impulsive. They can be overindulgent. They can feel regretful. They can scatter their energy to the winds and then feel lost and they can feel overwhelmed by all the urges and all the inner voices. So it's an interesting question. What would you say is your primary pull? We're not just one. We have all those qualities, but I find we tend to have a domination by one. And when you sense which of these energies is strongest in you, it's very interesting to kind of sense, well, from where do they come? When you think of the relative self, the conditioned self, can you trace that back to how that pattern emerged? And it becomes a very powerful inquiry. When you're aware of the gift that comes from your conditioning, as well as the edges and the growth, when you trace that back and you can bring some empathy and some kindness to that, that becomes a very powerful doorway to healing and feeling more whole. Because what's happening is you're coming more in contact with a persona. You're coming more in contact with a Halloween mask that you put on. When I think back to my aversive qualities, to being kind of intimacy averse, it's very clear to me where that comes from. Very much of a middle child, not seen, not heard, and very much around minimizing my needs so I wouldn't be disappointed, and very much feeling kind of perpetually on the outside. I can live that way for the rest of my life, or I can bring some loving awareness to that. I can bring some compassion, some empathy to that. And I'm aware that conditioning is pretty locked in for me. And I'm also aware there's some gifts that come out of that. Absolutely, some really wonderful gifts that come out of that sense of my conditioning. but I don't have to be run by it. And this points to the power of mindfulness, that every time you step back, every time you come into here and now, non-judging, non-preferential awareness, you are no longer your persona. You're no longer the Halloween mask. You're immersing yourself in presence. The analogy which I love is the dyeing of indigo. If you dye cotton with indigo, which is this blue, this beautiful, intense blue dye. When you do the first dipping, you take this white cotton and you dip it in the indigo, you pull it out, it's this vibrant blue, you hang it up to dry, and then as it dries, it fades to almost white, a slight tinge of blue. You dip it again, you pull it out, vibrant blue, and you dry it, and again, it dries almost white, but a little more of the hue of the blue. Depending on how many times you dip the white cotton into the blue indigo, it will take on more and more of the color. So when you see indigo, it ranges from a light blue to an almost of a black, all depending on how many times you dipped it. And that's what our consciousness does. The more you immerse yourself in that sense of presence, of unconditioned self, the more consciousness takes on that quality. And so you become more and more aware that you are not your persona. You are not your conditioning. That yes, it's there, but awareness is living through it. And just as you don't need to believe every thought, you don't need to believe that you are that conditioning. And this is so much the power of the practice. So much of the power of inner freedom. And so the question then is like, how do you be in the world? How do you be in the relational world? With this intention to immerse yourself more and more and more into the unconditioned self, so you have more and more freedom. As one of my teachers said, the key to your heart is locked inside the heart of the other. And paradoxically, it's through our relationships where we can potentially, powerfully wake up. And there's a big distinction between la 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 kumbaya and the reality of working with people who may not be on the same vibrational level, at the same page as you. And this is where I found an inquiry super, super helpful. Some years back, there was some conflict in my extended family, and my extended family's got a variety of personalities and political affiliations and life perspectives. So it's not a homogeneous collection of human beings. And I was upset about something. I can't even remember what it was, but I'm sure it had to do with not feeling seen, not feeling heard, all that kind of stuff. And feeling this tension building and getting more and more unsettled in my meditation practice, like really feeling a grudge, really feeling some anger. And again, I'm head of the non-confrontational debate team, but I really felt I really need to speak into this. You know the phrase, what you can't communicate controls you. It's a lot of power. And I was aware that I was holding a lot in. And I thought, I really need to speak to this. And so I did a whole deep reflection. And part of this was acknowledging what I was feeling. You know, I was feeling upset, I was feeling angry, I was feeling separate. And then what was I needing? I needed to be seen, I needed to be heard, I needed to be expressed. And then I did that role reversal. What was this person feeling? Well, I wasn't sure what they were feeling. I think they were kind of feeling unaware of what I was feeling. What were they needing? Well, they were needing to be right, I think. You know, they just needed to be right, which wasn't working for me. And then it brought these 5 questions, which are sort of a reflection of the Buddha's guidelines around wise speech, where you ask yourself, is what I'm going to say truthful? Is what I'm going to say helpful? Is what I'm going to say kind? Is what I'm going to say timely? And is what I'm going to say something the other person can hear? So I sifted through those questions. Is what I'm going to say truthful? Well, I really had to give that some thought because I realized I was hyped up with my perspective. So it was a very helpful editing process to really sense, is what I'm going to say truthful and something the other person would recognize as true rather than trumped up charges, Is what I'm going to say helpful? Again, that forced me into a role reversal. Like, would this actually be of value for the other person? And I thought, if they could hear this, I think this would be really, really helpful for them to recognize someone else has a different point of view than them. Is what I'm going to say kind? Well, okay. How can I put this in a way that they could actually hear it? Is what I'm going to say timely? Well, I realized I'd have to really find a way where I could, get a one-on-one with this person at a family gathering. And then the 5th, is this something the other person can hear? And then it was like, no. I realized they are not going to be able to hear this. It was somewhat disappointing when I realized that no, they really were not on for this message. They did not have the bandwidth. It was disappointing, but it was also, in a way, it was liberating. When I realized that if I really, really give myself consciously to this communication, this person's not going to be able to hear me. That was a really powerful insight. And you might ask yourself, and I'm aware our time is coming to a close. I see that I have just about 7 minutes left. That when you are in conflict with someone, asking these questions can be really, really helpful. First of all, awareness of self. What am I feeling? What am I needing that's not happening? And then to role reverse, to really step into the other person's experience. Well, what are they feeling right now? What are they needing that's not happening? And then to ask yourself, is what I'm going to say truthful? Is what I'm going to say helpful? Is what I'm going to say kind? Is it based in kindness? Is the timing right? And is this something the other person can hear? I have found taking the time to really reflect on these questions has helped me enormously. It has helped me to find the language that can reach across that ocean of divide, to find the language, to find kind of the resonance, to be able to communicate what I was not able to communicate before. Not all the time, per this example, but some of the time. And super, super helpful. And when I think about the conflict in our world right now, how do we communicate when we're in conflict, when we're feeling bullied, when the other person or the other side is convinced that they are right, no questions asked? It becomes really, really challenging. Because these 3 poisons get so strong. The greed, the hatred, the confusion that's out there. And when I see and tune into the anger, the hatred, the zero capacity to hear what anyone else has to say, and how many people are being motivated into action through anger and through outrage, it becomes enormously challenging and sometimes a little depressing. But then it comes down to, what do I have control over? And what do I not have control over? which is where you may find that applying these inquiries into your immediate relationships can be really, really satisfying. The number one regret of the dying is I was not true to myself. And at least in your most intimate relationships, is it possible to explore that? To imagine on your deathbed, to think to yourself, I was true. I was true to myself. I spoke my truth. The idea of that is really quite exciting. One of the other elements of the regret of the dying, there are a number of them, but another one is I didn't stay in touch with the people who were important to me. That one struck me as kind of an intimacy avoidant person, that there are just a number of people, a number of relationships that have sort of fallen away. People who I appreciate, people who have meant a lot to me, and it's sort of incentivized for me a sense of like wanting to at least let people know how much they meant to me. And so this possibility of speaking from the heart requires that you be really aware of your side of the equation, to be aware of your conditioned self, to be aware of your patterns, what you bring to the table, and to take ownership for your relationship of being with others. It also requires your capacity to move into another person's experience. When you have the bandwidth to open to another person's wants and desires and unmet needs, you have the capacity to influence them with integrity, for good or bad, but you also have the capacity to help formulate and make connection, to make true connection, which is pretty exciting stuff. And then these reflections on wise speech, I hope you find them helpful. Because to communicate from the heart means you have to be aware of what's blocking the heart, what's in the way. And this again is where having this incredible gift of moving from the conditioned self to the unconditioned, to allow yourself to be steeped in present moment, non-judging awareness, becomes this incredible nectar and fuel that can not only awaken you, but to move into awakening in the relational field. So with that, why don't we close with just a few moments of reflection and meditation. If you like, you can close your eyes. And if you would, take 3 slow, smooth, and deep breaths. Imagine, if you wish, your heart full and overflowing. Imagine yourself free from these 3 powerful energies, who you are in the absence of desire and wanting, content. Who you are in the absence of aversion and judgment and blame. And who you are in the absence of confusion. And taking 3 slow, deep breaths. Allow yourself just to feel, for these few moments, this quality of non-judging, open, spacious presence. Your capacity to open into loving awareness. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. Blessings to you in your journey, not only in your solo journey, but in this wild relational ride as well. Take good care.